Chapter 60 of No Quarter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. No Quarter by Thomas Mayne REID. Chapter 60. Quartered upon the enemy. Night had descended over Hollymead. A dark night, too, though there was no lack of light inside the house or around it. Nearing November, the atmosphere had a frosty feel, and great wood fires were burning in the wide chimney places of the reception rooms. Without, in the center of the courtyard, a very bonfire had been kindled, which sent its red glare and glow to the most distant corner of the enclosure. Around this were seated or standing, in every variety of attitude, such of the common soldiers of the escort as were not upon duty, carousing, of course. For the rank and file of the Royalist army, especially that portion of it which acted under Rupert, followed the fashion of their officers, and one of the affectations of cavalierism was to display a superior capacity for indulgence in drink. About the house they had found the wherewithal to give them a good supper, with more than drink enough to wash it down. For when Monmouth fell into the hands of the parliamentarians, the master of Hollymead, thinking it safe, had done something to restock his pastures, as also replenish larder and cellars. And once more these were in the way of getting speedily depleted. The thirsty troopers around the courtyard fire, quaffing a free tap from a cask of ale they had rolled out upon the pavement, while they bandied coarse jests, told indecent stories, and sang songs of like character, roaring in chorus. Inside there was revelry also, of a less crude kind. Still revelry, and coarse enough, considering that they who indulged in it composed the entourage of a prince. In the dining hall was it being held, around a table on which stood a varied assortment of bottles and decanters, goblets and glasses. There had been a repast upon it, that same dinner-supper, but the dishes and debris of solids had been removed, and only the drinking materials remained. Nearly a score of guests encircled it, all gentlemen, and all in military uniform, being the officers of the escort, not a man in civilian garb seen among them. For the master of the house was not at the head of his own table, as might have been expected. Instead, shut up in one of the rooms adjacent, its door locked, and a sentry stationed outside. His daughters were upstairs in their private apartment, from which they had never come down. Through the window they had seen their father brought back under guard as a felon, saw it with indignation, but also fear. Greater became the last, when told they could not hold speech with him, or have access to the room in which he was confined. Denied interview with their own father, in their own house. Inhumanity that augured ill for what was to come after. What this might be, they could neither tell nor guess. They even feared to reflect upon it, trembling at every footstep on the stairs, though no key had been turned upon them, nor a sentry set at their door. They were as much imprisoned as their father, for the prince's retinue of servants filled the house, tramping and roaming about everywhere, and bullying the family domestics. It was not safe to go out among them, and the young ladies had locked themselves up, dreading insult, if not absolute outrage. Even Gwenthien dared not trust herself downstairs, and shared their confinement. What did it all mean? Why such change in the behavior of the prince, so late pretending amiability? For his people must have sanction, or they would not be so acting. The explanation was simple, withal. Shortly after Rupert's arrival at Hollymead, a courier, who had followed him from Monmouth, brought tidings of another royalist reverse. Chepstow, with its castle, taken and closely beleaguered. Exasperated by the intelligence, he no longer resisted the wicked proposals of Lunsford, but gave willing assent to them. And now, having thrown off the mask, he had determined on taking the whole Powell family back with him to Bristol. As his prisoner there, he could do with a bit of saucy sweetness, as it might please him, as he had done with many other unfortunate women, whom the chances of war had brought within his wanton embrace. It had been all settled, save some details about the departure from Hollymead, the time, and the return route. These were now being discussed between him and the commanding officer of his escort, as they sate at a side table, to which they had temporarily withdrawn, to be out of earshot of the others. "Shall we remain here for the night, mine colonel, or make back to Monmouth? We can get there before midnight." "That we could, easily enough, your highness. But why go to Monmouth at all?" "Why not?" "There are 2 reasons against it, Prince, both good ones." "Give them, Sir Thomas." "If it is true that Chepstow's lost to us, there may be a difficulty in our crossing the Wye down there, or getting over to the Ost passage of the Severn with such a weak force as attends your highness." "Gott, yes, I perceive that. But what's your other reason against Monmouth way?" "A more delicate one. To pass through that town with such a captive train as your highness will have might give tongue for scandal. The venerable Marquis of Worcester is rather squeamish, besides not being your best friend." "You know that, Prince?" "I do know it, and will some day make him sorry for it, the old papist hypocrite. But what other route would you have us take?" "Down through the forest direct, and across the Severn, either at Newnham or Westbury. There's a ferry at both places, with horse boats enough to take us all over in a trip or 2. We may reach Berkeley Castle before daylight, where, if it be your highness's pleasure to lie up for the day, you could enter Bristol on the following night without all the world being the wiser as to the sort of prisoners we carried in." "Egad, your reasons are good. I am inclined to follow your advice, and return by the route you speak of. Are you well acquainted with it, mine colonel?" "Reasonably well, your highness, but Captain Trevor knows it better than I. He was longer with Sir John Wintower, and is familiar with every crook and turn of the forest roads in that quarter. There can be no danger of our going astray. But the night's dark as pitch, so one has just told me." "True it is now, your highness, but there'll be a moon this side midnight, and that'll be time enough to start. We can make Berkeley before morning, prisoners crossing the Severn and all delays notwithstanding. Next night your highness may sleep in your own bed within the walls of Bristol Castle, with a sweet creature to share it, whom I need not designate by name." "She shall share it," rejoined the royal reprobate, in reckless but determined tone, his wicked passions fired by the wine he had been drinking. "And we go that way, colonel. So see that all be ready for the route soon as the moon shows her sweet face. Meanwhile, let us back to our comrades and be merry." Saying which, he returned to the chair he had vacated at the head of the table, the other along with him. Then, grasping a filled goblet, he called out the cavalier's orthodox sentiment, "The wenches," adding, "Colonel Lunsford will respond with a song, gentlemen," which the colonel did, giving that they liked best. With a chorus they could all join in. "We'll drink, drink, and our goblets clink, quaffing the blood-red wine. The wenches we'll toast, and the Roundheads we'll roast, the Croppies and all their kind." The coarse refrain, with the ribald jests that followed it, could be heard all over the house, reaching the ears of its imprisoned owner. Even those of his daughters, more distant, did not escape being offended by them. No wonder at both having in their hearts, if not on their lips, the prayer, "God speed Win upon her errand." End of chapter 60. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 61 of No Quarter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. No Quarter by Thomas Mayne REID. Chapter 61. A Courageous Waiter. The Severn was in flood, its wide valley a sheet of water which extended miles from either bank, and far up north toward Worcester. Viewed from an eminence, it looked as if the primeval sea, which once washed the foots of the Malvern Hills, had rolled back over its ancient bed. The city of Gloucester seemed standing on an island, some of its houses that lay low, submerged and only approachable by boats, while the causeways of the roads leading from it were under water, in places to a depth of several feet. This is what had hindered Ambrose Powell arriving at Hollymead House many hours earlier than that on which he was taken to it a prisoner. For soon as receiving news of the recapture of Monmouth, instinctively apprehending danger to the dear ones so unwisely left alone, he had hurriedly started homeward, to be delayed by the obstructing flood. Nearing home, with heart a prey to anxiety, harassed by the thought of his own imprudence, at length reaching it, to find his worst fears realized, himself no longer free. The waters still prevailing in the Severn Valley and around Gloucester, it seemed impossible to enter that city save by boat. Yet on that same night a pedestrian could have been seen making towards it from the direction of Mitchell-Dean, one who meant it as the objective point of her journey, for it was a woman. The great cathedral clock was just tolling 9 p.m. as she descended into the lowlands near Hynham, and came to a stop by the edge of the inundated district. It was dark, the moon still below the horizon, but her precursory rays, reflected from fleecy clouds above it, threw a faint light over the aqueous surface, sufficient to make objects distinguishable at a good 100 yards distance. Copses that seemed inlets, with the tufted heads of pollard willows rising weird-like out of the water, were the conspicuous features of the flooded landscape. Rows of the latter marked the boundaries of meadows, but two running parallel, with a narrower list between, indicated the causeway of the road. The woman had approached at this point at a rapid pace, and though brought to a stand, it was but a momentary pause, without thought of turning back. Her attitude and the expression upon her features told of a determination to continue on and get inside Gloucester, if it were possible, in all haste too, for as the strokes of the great clock bell came booming over the water, she counted them with evident anxiety, in fear of their tolling 10 instead of 9. Even the lesser number seemed scarcely to satisfy her, as if withal she might be too late for the business she was bent upon. She but waited for the final reverberation, then drawing her skirts knee-high, walked boldly into the flood and onward. Ankle-deep at the first step, she was soon in water that washed around her garters, here and there with a current, too, which threatened to sweep her off her feet. But it did not deter her from advancing, and on she went, without stop or show of hesitation. no sign of quailing in her eye. At knee's length, as ere long she was, still enough of her showed above the surface to represent the stature of an ordinary woman. For she was not an ordinary woman, in height or otherwise, being Winnie, the cageress. On tramped the courageous wader, unplunged, till the water was up to mid-thigh. No more then did her face show fear, nor sign of intention to turn back. She would have gone on had it come to swimming, for swim she could, many the time having bathed her body in both Severn and Wye. That was not needed now, though very near it. Even over the raised ridge of the causeway the flood was feet deep, but familiar with the route, having the landmarks in her memory, for it was not her first time to travel that road when submerged. She knew all its turns and bearings, how to take them, took them, and at length, having passed the deepest depths, saw before her the Severn's Bridge, with its elevated tete de pont, and beyond, the massive tower of the cathedral, amidst a surrounding of roofs and chimneys. Her perilous journey was near its end, the toilsome journey nigh over, and she felt happy, for as through frost some 12 months before, she had approached Bristol with pleasant anticipations, so now was she about to enter Gloucester with the same, and from a similar cause. Her expectancy was realized sooner than she had hoped for, the result identical to a degree of oddness, for just as upon the night at Bristol, so on this at Gloucester, Rob Wilde chanced to be guard sergeant of the gate by which she sought admission. And once again went their great arms around each other, their lips closing in kisses loud and fervent as ever. "God Almighty, Win!" he exclaimed, still holding her in honest amorous embrace. "What bet now? Why hast thou come hither through the flood? Dear girl, ye be's wet up to the—" "No matter how high, Rob," she said, interrupting. "If 'twere up to the neck, there'd be good reasons for't." "What reasons?" "News I hae brought frae Roisin, rayther us say Hollymead." "Bad news be they? I needn't ax. I see it in your face." "Bad enough, though nothing more than might have been expected after the Cavaliers being back at Monmouth, and Masters theer. Ye hae heard that, I suppose?" "Oh, certainly. The news got here day afore yesterday in the night." "But frae Hollymead? A troop o' 'em there, numbering nigh 200 horse soldiers in scarlet, wi' all sorts o' grand trappings. The Prince Rupert's they be. Us hae come wi' a message to Sir Richard, so I needn't tell ye who 'tid be from." "No, ye needn't, I can guess. Then ye maun see him at once. We not a minute delay. Us hae got a letter for him, and she as sent it said the deliverin' be a thing o' life and death. I knows that myself, Rob." "Come along, love. The Colonel be in his quarters, I think. He were by the gate here only a short whiles ago, and gied me orders for reporting to him there. Another kiss, Win, dear, fore's we get into company." The favour was conceded, soon as asked, and after another hug, with more than one osculation, the two great figures moved off side by side through the darkness. End of chapter 61. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 62 of No Quarter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. No Quarter by Thomas Mayne REID. Chapter 62. Their Dear Ones in Danger. As the sergeant conjectured, Colonel Walwyn was in his quarters. Eustace Trevor, his almost constant companion, along with him. The ever-active governor of Gloucester was absent on another of his many expeditions, and had left Colonel Broughton in chief command of the garrison, Sir Richard commanding its cavalry force with a separate jurisdiction. The duties of the day over, with all guards stationed for the night, he, with his young troop captain, having just completed the grand rounds, had returned to quarters and taken seat by a brisk wood fire, the night, as already said, being chill. Hubert was bustling about in attendance upon him, for though a gaudy trumpeter, he took delight in serving his revered colonel in every possible capacity. There was nothing menial in waiting upon such a master. So thought the faithful henchman. He had uncorked a bottle of claret and placed it on the table between them, which they proceeded to discuss as they reviewed the events of the day. The knight was no anchorite, neither the sea-deviant gentleman usher, both accustomed to take their wine in a moderate way, and both habitually cheerful, save when some reverse of arms gave reason for their being otherwise. Such there was now, or lately had been, that of Monmouth still in their minds. Sir Richard regretted not having been himself charged to keep the place he had been chiefly instrumental in capturing. Had it been so, the enemy would not so easily have retaken it. That he might think or say without any self-conceit. For in the most blundering manner had Major Throgmorton, left in temporary command, managed its defence, in truth making no defence at all, but allowing the Royalists to re-enter almost without striking blow. The affair was truly farcical, however serious for the Parliament. Its county committee was at the time in session, decreeing fines and sequestrations against the Monmouthshire malignants, when all at once, confronted by the very men with whose estates and chattels they were playing at confiscation, these armed and angrily vociferating, "Surrender! You are our prisoners!" Never were judicial deliberations brought to a more abrupt ending. Never transfer of authority more ludicrously sudden. Though it was aught but a jesting matter to the dispossessed ones, who from a comfortable council chamber were instantly hurried off to the cells of a dismal jail. Of course the Cavaliers made fun over the affair, while reversely their adversaries were chagrined and humiliated by it. Few grieved over the event in a greater degree than Colonel Walwyn and Captain Eustace Trevor, for they had special reasons. "I only wish I'd known of that danger when we got Massey's order to march hither," observed the former as they sat sipping their wine. "What would you have done, Sir Richard?" "Disobeyed it, and marched our men in opposite direction to Monmouth." "Ah, true. A pity you didn't. It might have been the saving of the place. No use lamenting the disaster now it's done. Would that the taking of the town were all you and I, Trevor, had concern about. Unfortunately, it isn't. What madness leaving the girls at Hollymead? Absolute insanity? It was. I thought so at the time, as did Vega. Sabrina, too, everybody but Powell himself. He couldn't be convinced there was any danger, and I still hope there may not be. But who knows what the upshot now? I tremble to think of it. It's to be regretted we didn't more press him to come away with us. Oh, that would have been of no use. I did urge it on him, far as I could becomingly, but he had one of his obstinate pig-headed fits upon him that day, and would listen to no reason. It's not pleasant having to speak so of him, whom we both look forward to as our future father-in-law. But when he's in that frame of mind, heaven and earth wouldn't move him, nor the devil frighten him either. You remember how he braved Lunsford and that precious cousin of yours, when they came to collect the king's loan? True, he had us and something besides at his back, but without that, he'd have defied them all the same. I had the whole royalist army been there threatening him with instant death. Then I fully believe. Yet one cannot help admiring his independence of spirit. So much of manhood in it, and so rare. Aye, true, but in that case too much recklessness. It has begot danger, and may bring disaster upon all of us, if it hasn't already. The last words, spoken in a grave, almost despondent tone, fell unpleasantly on the ear of Eustace Trevor, already sufficiently apprehensive of the thing hinted at. "In what way, Colonel?" he queried anxiously. "Are you thinking of any special danger?" "I am indeed, and to our dear ones." "But how? From what? Whom?" "Rather ask from where, and I'll answer Monmouth. Now that the Royalists are masters there, almost for certain they'll be raiding up into the forest, and likely, too likely, a party pay visit to Hollymead. That, as you know, Trevor, were danger enough for those we have fears for. But now that their father has gone to fetch them away, he should be there long before this. And long before this may be too late. Just what I'm most anxious about, the time of his arrival at Hollymead, for I know he won't stay there an instant. Poor man, he's sadly repentant of his imprudent act, and will make all haste to bring them back with him. The fear is of the flood having delayed him too long at starting. My fear." "Good heavens!" exclaimed the young officer. "Let us hope not." "If Massey were here," continued the other, a thought striking him, "I'd ask leave to go after him. Indeed, I feel half inclined to take it without asking." "And why not, Colonel? We could be at Rardine and back before morning, riding at a pace." Sir Richard was silent, seeming to ponder only for a few seconds, when, as if resolved, he sprang to his feet, saying, "I'll risk it, whatever the result, and we shall start at once, taking our own fellows along with us, Hubert." Quick as the call came, the trumpeter from aft ante-room, where he had stayed in waiting to receive the order, "To the men's quarters, and sound the assembly. Lose not a moment." And not a moment lost the trumpeter, knowing that when Colonel Walwyn gave an order in such excited strain, it meant promptest obedience. Snatching up his trumpet, as he hurried out through the ante-room, he was in the street in an instant, hurrying towards the cavalry quarters. End of chapter 62. Recording by John Brandon. Chapter 63 of No Quarter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. No Quarter by Thomas Mayne REID. Chapter 63. An Exciting Epistle. "Trevor," cried the colonel to his troop captain, now also upon his feet and sharing his excitement, "send out an orderly to summon Harley and our other officers. Perhaps you had best go yourself. You know where to find them, I suppose?" "I think I do, Colonel." "Use all dispatch, as we've made up our minds to this thing. The sooner we're in the saddle, the better." The counsel to make haste was little called for. Eustace Trevor itched to be in the saddle, as ever disciple of St. Hubert on the first day of fox hunting. But just as he was about to step over the threshold of the outer door, he saw a party approaching, evidently with the design to enter. 2 individuals they were, a man and a woman, still within the dim light of the overshadowing houses. For all, he had no difficulty in recognizing them. Colossal stature, as theirs was, far from common, the pair being Rob Wilde and Winnie. He saw them with some surprise, at least the woman, for he had not expected seeing her there. There she was, though, and, as quick intuition told him, her presence might have some bearing on that he was about to issue forth, for he awaited their coming up. Soon they stood at the door, face to face with him, the sergeant saluting soldier fashion, while the woman curtsied. "You, Winifred," exclaimed the young officer, "I was not aware of your being in Gloucester." "Her han't been in it more'n 10 minutes, Captain," said the sergeant, speaking for her. "I had just lets her in at the gate. Her be wantin' a word wi' the colonel." "She'll be welcome to that, I'm sure. But first go in yourself and see." This was in accordance with military etiquette, indeed regulations. No stranger admitted to the presence of a commanding officer without being announced and permission given. Rob himself came not under the rule, and was about to pass inside, when a thought occurring to Captain Trevor, the latter turned upon his heel and preceded him. "Well, Wilde, what is it?" asked Sir Richard, as they entered the room, eagerly too, seeing that the features of the big sergeant wore a portentous expression. "Any trouble with your gate guard?" "No, Colonel, nothing of that." "Some news come in?" "Just so, Sir Richard, and not o' the best nayther." "Indeed, what news? Whence?" "Fra Rudine, or to speak more partickler, fra Hollymead House." Both colonel and captain were now all ears. No spot on the habitable globe had such interest for them as Hollymead House, and from nowhere was intelligence so eagerly desired. "Tell it, sergeant," was the impatient command. "A party o' the king's soldiers be quartered there, cavalry." "Oh God!" exclaimed Eustace Trevor, almost in a groan, the knight also showing grievously affected. "How did you get this news?" "Win ha' brought it." "Win?" "Yes, Colonel. Her be outside the door, waitin' permission to speak wi' you. She had been trusted wi' a letter from the young ladies." "Bring her in instantly." "Singular coincidence, Trevor," said Sir Richard, as the sergeant passed out. "Already at Hollymead. Just what we've been fearing." "Indeed so, and all the more reason for our being there too." "I wonder who they are. Lingon's, think you?" "Rob says they're quartered there." "That would hardly be Lingon's, so near his own garrison at Goodrich. More like some of Lord Herbert's horse from Monmouth, and I hope it may be they." "Ay, true. It might be worse, but we'll soon hear. The cageress can tell, no doubt, and it'll be in the letter." The door reopening showed the forest Amazon outside, Rob conducting her in. They could see that she was wet to the waist, her saturated skirt clinging around limbs of noble outline, while her heaving bosom, with the heightened color of her cheeks, told of a journey but just completed and made in greatest haste. "You have a letter for me?" said Richard interrogatively, as she stepped inside the room. "Yes, your honour, fra Hollymead. She spoke with hand raised to her head as if adjusting one of the plaits of her hair. Instead, she was searching among them for the concealed epistle, which, soon found, was handed over to him, for whom it was intended. No surprise to Sir Richard at seeing a thing more like curl paper than letter. It was not the first time for him to receive such in a similar way, and straightening it out under the lamplight, he was soon acquainted with its contents. So far from having the effect of allaying his excitement, they but increased it, and he cried out to the sergeant, as he had to the trumpeter, "Quick to the men's quarters, Wild, and help getting all ready for the route. Hubert's there by this time, and will have sounded the assembly. Read that, Trevor. There's something that concerns you." And he handed the letter to his troop captain. The sergeant hurried away, leaving Wynne to be further questioned by the colonel, and while this was going on, the young officer perused the epistle to be affected by it in a similar fashion. It ran thus: "Ill tidings, Richard. Prince Rupert here, with his escort, about 200, has just arrived, and intends staying the night. Indeed, till father return home, he says. I hope father will not come home, unless you come with him. I'm sure they mean him harm. That horrid man Lunsford is in the prince's suit. Reginald Trevor, too. Winnie will tell you more. I fear to lose time in writing. Dear Richard, come if you can." So the body of the epistle, with below a postscript in a different handwriting well known to Eustace Trevor. "Dearest Eustace, we are in danger, I do believe." The words were significant, and no form of appeal for rescue could have been more pressing, nor was such needed, neither any urging of haste upon the men thus admonished. Never was squadron of cavalry sooner in the saddle after getting orders than was Walwyn's horse on that night. In less than 20 minutes later, they went at a gallop through the northwestern gate of Gloucester, opened to give them exit, then on along the flooded causeway, riding rowels deep, plunging and flinging the spray drops high in air, till every man was dripping wet, from the plume in his hat to the spurs upon his heels. End of chapter 63. Recording by John Brandon.
Chapter 64 of No Quarter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matthew Reece, Cordova, Illinois. No Quarter by Thomas Mayne REID. Chapter 64. A House on Fire. The moon had risen, but only to be seen at intervals. Heavy cumuli drifting sluggishly athwart the sky now and then drew curtain-like over her disk, making the earth dark as Erebus. Between these recurrent cloud eclipses, however, her light was of the clearest, for the atmosphere otherwise was without haze or mist. She was shining in full effulgence, as a body of horsemen commenced breasting the pitch which winds up from Mischella to the wilderness. Their distinctive standard was sheathed, not needing to display in the night. But the green uniforms and the cock's tail feathers pluming their hats told them to be Walwyn's horse, the foresters. They were still wet with the floodwater through which they had waded after clearing the gates of Gloucester. Their horses, too, the coats of these further darkened by sweat, save where the flakes of white froth tossed back on their necks and counters gave them a piebald appearance. All betokened a terrible pace, and such had they kept up, scarce slowing for an instant from the flood's edge till they entered the town of Mischella. Then it was but a momentary halt in the street, and without leaving the saddle, just long enough to inquire whether Master Ambrose Powell had that day passed through the place. He had, late in the afternoon. On horseback, without any attendant, and apparently in great haste. "Prisoner or not, they have him at Hollymead now," observed Sir Richard to Eustace Trevor, as they trotted on through the town to the foot of the hill where the road runs up to the wilderness. To gallop horses already blown against that steep acclivity would have been to kill them, but the leader of the party, familiar with it, did not put them to the test. Instead, commanded a walk. And while riding side by side, he and his troop captain held something of a lengthened conversation, up to that time only a few hurried words having been exchanged between them. "I wish the letter had been a little more explicit as to their numbers," said Sir Richard. "About 200 may mean 3, or only 1. A woman's estimate is not the most reliable in such matters." "What did the cadgeress say of it, Colonel? You questioned her, I suppose?" "Minutely, but to no purpose. She only came to the house after they had scattered all around it, and, of course, had no definite idea of their number. So we shan't know how many we'll have to cross swords with till we get upon the ground." "If we have the chance to cross swords with any. I only wish we were sure of that." "The deuce! They may be gone away, you think?" "Rather fear it, Sir Richard. Powell must have reached Hollymead before nightfall, and if they intended making him a prisoner, 'twould be done at once, with no object for their staying afterwards." "Unless they have done a long day's march, and meant to quarter there for the night. If they went thither direct from Bristol, which is like enough, that's just what they'd do, stay the night, and start back for Bristol in the morning." "I have fears, Colonel, we won't find it so. More likely the prince was at Monmouth on account of what's happened there, and will return to it. Has returned already." "If so, Trevor, 'twill be a black night for you and me. A bitter disappointment, and something worse. If he's gone from Hollymead, so will they. Father, daughters, all. Rupert's not the sort to leave such behind, within a better like Tom Lunsford. As for your cousin, remember how you crossed him. It's but natural he should feel spiteful, and show it in that quarter." "If he do, I'll cross him worse when we come to crossing swords. And I'll find the chance. We've made mutual promise to give no quarter, almost sworn it. If ill befall Vega Powell through him, I'll keep that promise faithfully as any oath." "But right you should, and for settling scores you may soon have the opportunity, I trust within the hour." "Then, Colonel, you think they'll still be at Hollymead?" "I hope it, rather, grounding my hope on another habit of this German prince. One he has late been indulging to excess, 'tis said." "Drink?" "Just so. In the which Lunsford, with a head hard as his heart, will stand by him cup for cup." "But can that affect their staying at Hollymead?" "Certainly it can, probably will." "How, Sir Richard?" "By their getting inebriated there, or, at all events, enough so to make them careless about moving off before the morning. The more as they can't be expecting any surprise from this side. You remember there was a fair stock of wine in the cellars when we were there, best sorts, too. Let loose at that, they're likely to stay by it as long as the tap runs." "God grant it may run till morning, then," was the prayer of the young officer, fervently spoken. In his ways of thought and speech 2 years' campaigning had made much change, deepening the gravity of one naturally of serious turn. "No matter about morning," rejoined Sir Richard. "If it but hold out for another hour, and we find them there, something else will then be running red as the wine. Ah, Master Lunsford, one more meeting with you, that's what I want now. If I'm lucky enough to have it this night will be the last of your life." The apostrophe, which was but a mental reflection, had reference to something Sabrina had been telling him, vividly recalled by the words in her latest letter, "that horrid man." At the same instant, and in similar strain, was Eustace Trevor reflecting about his cousin Reginald, making mental vow that, if Vega suffered shame by him, neither would his life be of long endurance. By this they had surmounted the pitch, and arrived at a spot Both had good reason to remember. It was the piece of level turf where, once bearing blades, they had come so near sending one or other out of the world. Their horses remembered it too. They were still riding the same. And with a recollection which had a result quaintly comical. Soon as on the ground, without check of rein or word said, they came to a sudden halt, turned head to head, snorting and angry-like, as if expecting a renewal of the combat. All the more strange this behavior on the part of the animals that, since their hostile encounter, for now over 2 years they had been together in amiable association. A circumstance so odd, so ludicrous, could not fail to excite the risibility of their riders, and laugh both did, despite their serious mood at the moment. To their following it but caused surprise. 2 alone comprehending, so far as to see the fun of it. These Hubert, the trumpeter, and the light varlet, then so near coming to blows with him, who, through thick and thin, had ever since stuck to the ex-gentleman usher, his master. No doubt the little interlude would have led to some speech about it, between the chief actors and the more serious encounter it recalled, but for something, at that moment seen by them, turning their thoughts into a new channel. Away westward, beyond Drybrook, beyond Rardine Ridge, the sky showed a clearness that had naught to do with the moon's light. Instead was ruddier and shone brighter, as this became obscured by a thick cloud drifting over her disk. A glowing, gleaming light, unusual in a way, but natural enough regarded as the glare of a conflagration, which, in reality, it was. "House on fire over yonder?" cried one of the soldiers. "May be only a haystack," suggested a second. "More like a town, judging by the big blaze," reasoned a third. "There's no town in that direction, only Rardine. Where's we be going?" "Why maun't it be Rardine, then?" queried the first speaker, "or the church?" "And a good thing, if it be the church," put in one of strong Puritan proclivities. "It want burnin' down, as every other, with their altars and images. They be a curse to the country, the parsons too. They've taken sides with the stinkin' Cavaliers, against Parliament and people all along." "That's true," endorsed another of like iconoclastic sentiments. "And if it ain't the church as be givin' up that light, let's illuminate it when we get there. I go for that." A proposal which called forth a chorus of assenting responses. While this play of words was in progress along the line of rank and file rearwards, the Colonel and Captain Trevor, at its head, were engaged in a dialogue of conjectures about the same, a brief one. "What do you think it is?" asked Sir Richard, as they sat halted in their saddles regarding the garish light. "It looks to be over Rardine, or near it." "A fire of some kind, Colonel. No common one, either." "A farmer's rick?" "I fear not. Would we were sure of its being only that." "Ha! A house, you think?" "I do, Sir Richard." "And?" "The one we're making for." "By heavens, I believe it is. It bears that way to a point. Rardine's more to the right. Yes, it must be Hollymead." Both talked excitedly, but no more words passed between them there and then. The next heard was the command, "March! Double quick!" And down the hill to Drybrook went they at a gallop, over the tiny stream, and up the long winding slope round the shoulder of Rardine Hill, without halt or draw on bridle. There only poising for an instant, as they came within view of the village, and saw the conflagration was not in, but wide away from it, the glare and sparks ascending over the spot where Hollymead House should be, but was no more. As, continuing their gallop, they rode in through the park gates, it was to see a vast blazing pile, like a bonfire built by Titans, the faggot's great beams heaped together confusedly, from which issued a hissing and crackling, with at intervals loud explosions, as from an ordnance magazine on fire. End of Chapter 64. Recording by Matthew Reece, Cordova, Illinois. Chapter 65 of No Quarter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matthew Reece, Cordova, Illinois. No Quarter by Thomas Mayne REID. Chapter 65. Very Near an Encounter. Micheldean lies at the foot of the steep facade already spoken of as forming a periphery to the elevated forest district. The slope ascends direct from the western skirts of the little town, but outlying ridges also enclose it on the north, east, and south, so that even the tall spire of its church is invisible from any great distance. So situated, railways give it a wide berth, and few places better deserve the title secluded. The only sort of traveler who ever thinks of paying it a visit is the commercial, or some pedestrian tourist crossing the forest from the Severn side to view the more picturesque scenery of the Wye, with intention to make stoppage at the ancient hostelry of the Speech House, midway between. In the days of the saddle and pack horse, however, things were different with Micheldean. Being on one of the direct routes of travel from the metropolis to South Wales, and a gate of entry, as it were, to the forest on its eastern side, it was then a place of considerable note, its people accustomed to all sorts of wayfarers passing daily, hourly through it. Since the breaking out of the rebellion, these had been mostly of the military kind, though not confined to either party in the strife. One would march through today, the other tomorrow, so that, hearing the trample of hoofs, rarely could the townsmen tell whether royalists or parliamentarians were coming among them, till they saw their standards in the street. They would rather have received visit from neither, but, compelled to choose, preferred seeing the soldiers of the Parliament. So when Walwyn's horse came rattling along, their green coats with the cock's tail's feathers in their hats, distinguishable in the clear moonlight, the closed window shutters were flung open, and night-capped heads, for most had been abed, appeared in them without fear, exchanging speech with the soldiers halted in the street below. Altogether different their behavior when, in a matter of 10 minutes after, a second party of horsemen came to a halt under their windows, these in scarlet coats, gold-laced, with white ostrich feathers in their hats. The Prince of Wales' plume, with its appropriate motto of servility, Ich dien. Seeing it, the townsmen drew in their heads, closed the shutters, and were silent. Not going back to their beds, however, but to sit up in fear and trembling, till the renewed hoof-strokes told them of the halt over, and the red-coated cavaliers ridden off again. It need scarce be said that these were Rupert and his escort, en route for Westbury, and had Walwyn's horse stopped 10 minutes longer in Micheldean, the two bodies would have there met face to face, since they were proceeding in opposite directions. A mere accident hindered their encountering, the circumstance that from the town 2 roads led up to the forest, one on each side of the wilderness, both again uniting in the valley of Drybrook. The northern route had been taken by the parliamentarian party ascending, while the royalists descended by the southern one, called the Plump Hill, just at such time as to miss one another, though but by a few minutes. For the rearmost files of the former had barely cleared the skirts of the town going out, when the van of the latter entered it at a different point. The interval, however, was long enough to prevent those who went forestwards from getting information of what they were leaving so close behind. Could they have had that, quick would have been their return downhill, and the streets of Micheldean the arena of a conflict to the cry, "No quarter." As it was, the hostile cohorts passed peacefully through, out, and onwards on their respective routes, though Prince Rupert knew how near he had been to a collision, and could still have brought it on. But that was the last thing in his thoughts. Instead, soon as learning what had gone up to the forest, who they were, and who their leader, his stay in Micheldean was of the shortest, and his way out of it, not forestwards, but straight on for the Severn. And in all the haste he could make, cumbered as he was with captives, for he carried with him a captive train, a small one, consisting of but 3 individuals, scarce necessary to say, Ambrose Powell and his daughters. They were on horseback, the ladies wrapped in cloaks, and so close hooded that their faces were invisible. Even their figures were so draped as to be scarce distinguishable from those of men, all done with a design, not their own, but that of those who had them in charge. In passing through Micheldean, precautions had been taken to hinder their being recognized. Double files of their guards riding in close order on each side of them, so that curious eyes should not come too near. But when once more out on the country road, the formation by twos was resumed. The trio of prisoners, each with a trooper right and left, conducted behind the knot of officers on the prince's personal staff, he himself with Lunsford leading. Soon as outside the town, the two last, as usual riding together, and some paces in the advance, entered on dialogue of a confidential character. The prince commenced it, saying, "We've had a narrow escape, Sir Thomas." "Does your highness refer to our having missed meeting the party of Roundheads?" "Of course I do, just that." "Then I should say 'tis they who've had the narrow escape." "Nine, Colonel. Not so certain of that, knowing who they are. These foresters fight like devils, and, from all I could gather, they greatly outnumber us. I shouldn't so much mind the odds, but for how we're hampered. To have fought them and got the worst of it would have been ruinous to our reputation, as to the other thing." "It isn't likely we'd have got the worst of it. Few get the better of your highness that way." Lunsford's brave talk was not in keeping with his thoughts. Quite as pleased was he as the prince at their having escaped an encounter with the party of parliamentarians. For never man dreaded meeting man more than he, Sir Richard Walwyn. Words had of late been conveyed to him, from camp to camp and across neutral lines, warning words that his old enemy was more than ever incensed against him, and in any future conflict where the two should be engaged, meant singling him out and seeking his life. After what he had done now, was still doing, he knew another encounter with Walwyn would be one of life and death, and dreaded it accordingly. "Still, Prince," he added, "as you observe, considering our encumbrances, perhaps it's been for the best letting them off." "Aye, if they let us off, which they may not yet. Suppose some of the townsmen have followed, and told them of our passing through." "No fear of that, Prince. If anyone did follow, it's not likely they could be overtaken. They were riding as in a race, and won't draw bridle till they see the blaze over Hollymead. Then they'll but gallop the faster, in the wrong direction." "The right one for us, if they do. But even so, they would reach Hollymead in less than an hour, then turn short round to pursue, and in another hour be upon our heels. You forget that we can't say safety till we're over the Severn." "I don't forget that, Prince. But they won't turn round to pursue us." "Why say you that, Sir Thomas? How know you they won't?" "Because they won't suspect our having come this way. Never think of it. Before putting the torch to the old delinquent's house, I took the precaution to have all his domestics locked up in an outbuilding, that they shouldn't see which way we went off. And they, and the Rardine people, knew we came up from Monmouth. They'll naturally conclude that we returned thither. So, your highness, any pursuit of us will take the direction down Cat's Hill, instead of by Drybrook and down the Plump." "Egad, I hope so, Colonel. For, to speak truth, I don't feel in the spirit for a fight just now." It was not often Rupert gave way to cowardice, and more seldom confessed it, even in confidence to his familiars, of whom Lunsford was one of the most intimate. But at that hour he felt it to very fear, perhaps from the wine he had drunk at Hollymead, now cold in him, and it might be his conscience weighted with the crime he was in the act of committing. Whatever the cause, his nervousness became heightened rather than diminished as they marched on, and anxiously longed he to be on the other side of the Severn. Not more so than his reprobate companion, whose bravado was all assumed, his words of confidence forced from him to gloss over the mistake he had made in recommending the route taken. Sorry was he now, as his superior, that they had not gone by Monmouth. Within its castle walls they would at that moment have been safe, instead of hurrying along a road with the obstruction of a river in front and the possibility of pursuit behind. Aye, the probability of it, as Lunsford himself knew well, feigning to ignore it. "In any case, your highness," he continued in the same strain of encouragement, "we'll be out of their way in good time. From here it's but a step down to Westbury." By this they had reached the head of the ravine-like valley in which stands Flaxley Abbey, and were hastening forward fast as the impedimenta of captives would permit. The road runs down the valley, which, after several sinuosities, debouches on the Severn's plain. But long before attaining this, at rounding one of the turns, their eyes were greeted by a sight which sent tremor to their hearts. "Mein Gott!" cried the prince, suddenly reining up, and speaking in a tone of mingled surprise and alarm. "You see, Sir Thomas?" Sir Thomas did see, sharing the other's alarm, but without showing it, a sheet of water that shone silvery white under the moonlight, overspreading all the plain below. The river of flood and inundation everywhere. "We'll not be able to cross at all?" pursued the prince, in desponding interrogative. "Shall we?" "Oh, yes, your highness, I think so," was the doubting response. "The water can't be so high as to hinder us. At least, not likely. There's a pierhead at Westbury Passage on both sides, and the boats will be there as ever. I don't anticipate any great difficulty in the crossing, only we'll have to wade a bit." "Gott! That will be difficulty enough. Danger, too." "What danger, your highness?" "Through the meadows there's a raised causeway, and fortunately I'm familiar with every inch of it. While with Sir John Wintour, I had often occasion to travel it, more than once under water. Even if we can't make the Westbury Passage, we can that of Framelode, but a mile or two above. I've never heard of it being so flooded as to prevent passing over." "It may be, as you say, Sir Thomas, but the danger I'm thinking of has more to do with time than floods. Wading's slow work, and there's still the possibility of Walwyn and his greencoats coming on after us. Suppose they should, and find us floundering through the water." "No need supposing that, Prince. There isn't the slightest likelihood of it. I'd stake high that, at this minute, they're at the bottom of Cat's Hill, or it may be by Goodrich Ferry, seeking to cross over the Wye, as we the Severn. And, like as not, Lincoln will give them a turn if he gets word of their being about there. Sir Harry has now a strong force in the castle, and owes Dick Walwyn a revanche for that affair on the Hereford road, the morning after Curll led them into Monmouth." "For all, I wish we had gone Monmouth way," rejoined Rupert, as his eyes rested doubtingly on the white sheet of water widespread over the plain below. "I still fear they're pursuing us." "Even if they should, your highness, we need have no apprehension. The pursuit can't be immediate, and, please God, in another hour or so we'll be over the Severn, as likely they on the other side of the Wye, with both rivers between them and us." "Would that I were sure of that, Colonel," returned the prince, still desponding, "which I'm not. However, we've no alternative now but to cross here, if we can. You seem to have a doubt of our being able to make the passage of Westbury?" "I'm only a little uncertain about it, your highness." "But sure about that of Framelode?" "Quite. Though the flood be of the biggest and deepest." "Sehr wohl. With that assurance I'm satisfied. But we must have things secure behind ere we commence making our wade, and we may as well take the step now. So, Colonel, ride back along the line, detach a rear guard, and place it under some officer who can be trusted. Lose not a moment. Stay at halt here till you return to me." The commanding officer of the escort, as much alive to the prudence of this precaution as he who gave the orders for it, hastened to carrying them out. Done by detailing off a few of the rearmost files with directions to remain as they were, while the main body moved forward. Then instructions given to the officer who was to take charge of them, all occupying less than 10 minutes' time. After which, Lunsford again placed himself by the side of the prince, and the march was immediately resumed, down the valley of Flaxley, on for the flooded plain. End of chapter 65. Recording by Matthew Reece, Cordova, Illinois. Chapter 66 of No Quarter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matthew Reece, Cordova, Illinois. No Quarter by Thomas Mayne REID. Chapter 66, On the Trail. Words cannot depict the feelings of Sir Richard Walwyn and Eustace Trevor as they reined up by the burning house. With both it was anguish of the keenest, for they knew who were the incendiaries, and that incendiarism was not the worst of it. Those who ruthlessly kindled the flames had, with like ruth, carried off their betrothed ones. And for what purpose? A question neither colonel nor captain could help asking himself, though its conjectural answer was agony. For now, more vividly than ever, did Sir Richard recall what had been told him of Lunsford's designs upon Sabrina, while Trevor had also heard of Prince Rupert's partiality for Vaga. As they sate in their saddles, contemplating the ruin, they felt as might an American frontiersman returned home to find his cabin ablaze, fired by Indian torch, his wife or daughters borne off in the brutal embrace of the savage. No better fate seemed to have befallen the daughters of Ambrose Powell. White savages, very tigers, had seized upon and dragged them to their lair. It were no worse if red ones had been the captors. Rather would the bereaved lovers have had it so, sooner known their sweethearts buried under that blazing pile than in the arms of the profligate Rupert and Lunsford the bloody. Only for an instant did they give way to their anguish, or the anger which accompanied it, rage almost to madness. Both were controlled by the necessity of action, and the first wild burst over, action was taken, pursuit of the ravishers. Some time, however, before it could be fairly entered upon, inquiry made as to the direction in which they had gone. There were hundreds on the ground who could be interrogated. Half the people of Rardine were there. Roused from their beds by the cry, "Fire!" they had rushed out, and on to the scene of conflagration, but arrived too late to witness the departure of those who had set the torch, and could not tell which way they had gone. Neither could the house servants, now released from their lockup, for to hinder them doing so was the chief reason for their having been confined. As it was known to all that the Royalists had come up from Monmouth, conjecture pointed to their having returned thither. But conjecture was not enough to initiate a pursuit, and Colonel Walwyn was too practised a campaigner to rely upon it. Certainty of the route taken by the enemy was essential, else he might go on a wild-goose chase. As that could not be obtained at the burning house, not a moment longer stayed he by it, scarce 10 minutes in all from the time of their arrival till he gave the command, "About!" And about they went, back down the long avenue and through the park gate. Soon as outside, he shouted, "Halt!" bringing all again to a stand. He himself, however, with Captain Trevor and Sergeant Wilde, advancing along the road in the direction of Cat's Hill. Only 100 yards or so when they reined up. Then, by command, the big sergeant threw himself out of his saddle, and, bending down, commenced examination of the ground. Had Wilde been born in the American backwoods, he would have been a noted hunter and tracker of the leather-stocking type. As it was, his experience as a deer-stealer in the Forest of Dean had been sufficient to make the taking up a horse's trail an easy matter, and easier that of a whole troop. He could do it even in darkness, for it was dark then, the moon under a cloud. And he did it, in an instant. Scarce was he astoop, ere rising erect again, and turning face to Sir Richard, as if all had been ascertained. "Well, Rob," interrogated the latter, rather surprised at such quick work, "you see their tracks?" "I do, Colonel." "Going Cat's Hill way?" "No, Colonel, the contrary, comin' from. None of 'em fresh, neither." "Must have been made some time in the afternoon." "Have you assured yourself of that?" "I have, but I'll gie 'em another look, if ye wish it, Colonel." "Do." The Colossus again bent down and repeated his examination of the tracks, this time making a traverse or two, and going farther along the road. In a few seconds to return with a confirmation of his former report. A troop of cavalry had passed over it, but only in one direction, upward, and some hours before sunset. "Sure I am of that, as if I'd been here I'd seed 'em," was the tracker's concluding words. "Enough," said Sir Richard. "Into your saddle, and follow me." At which he gave his horse the spur and trotted back towards the park gate, not to rejoin his men, still at halt, however. Instead, he continued on along the road for Drybrook, the other two keeping with him. At a like distance from the halted line he again drew up, and directed the sergeant to make a similar reconnaissance. Here the reading of the sign occupied the tracker some little longer time, as there was a confusion of hoof marks. Some turned one way, some the other. Those that had the toe towards Hollymead Gate he knew to have been made by their own horses, but underneath, and nearly obliterated, were hundreds of others almost as fresh. "That's the trail of the scoundrels," said Sir Richard, soon as the sergeant reported the result of his investigation. "They've gone over to the Gloucester side, by Drybrook and Micheldene. How strange our not meeting them." "It is very strange," rejoined Trevor. "But could they have passed through Micheldene without our meeting them?" "Oh, yes, they could, Captain," put in Wild, once more mounted. "There be several byways through the forest as leads there, without touching a Drybrook. And I think I know the one them have took. When's us get to where it branch off their tracks'll tell." "Right, they will," said Sir Richard, laying aside conjecture, and calling to the officer in charge of the men to bring them on at quick pace. At quick pace they came, the colonel, Captain Trevor, and the big sergeant starting off before they were up, and keeping several horse lengths ahead. The route they were taking was the same they had come by, back for Drybrook, but coming and going their attitude was different. Then erect, with eyes turned upward regarding the glare over Hollymead, now bent down, cheeks to the saddle-bow, and glances all given to the ground. For, as Wild had said, there were several byways, any one of which the pursued party might have taken, and to go astray on the pursuit, even to the loss of 10 minutes' time, might be fatal to their purpose, the feather's weight turning the scale. But no danger now. The moon was giving a good light, and the road for long stretches was open, the trees on each side wide apart. So they had no difficulty in seeing what before they had not thought of looking for, the hoof marks of many horses that had gone towards Drybrook. The tracks of their own going the other way had almost obliterated them. Still, enough of the under ones were visible to show that two bodies of horse had passed in opposite directions, with but a short interval of time between. As this could be noted without the necessity of stopping or slowing pace, Colonel Walwyn carried his men on in a brisk canter, designing halt only at the branch road of which the sergeant had spoken. But, long before reaching it, they got information which made stoppage there unnecessary, as also further call on the ex-deer-stealer's skill as a tracker. For the time. Given by a man mounted on a hotel hack, who, coming on at a clattering gallop, met them in the teeth. His cry, "For the Parliament," without being challenged, proclaimed him a friend. And he was, the innkeeper of Micheldene, recognized on the instant by Sir Richard and Rob Wild. His coming up caused a halt, for his business was with Colonel Walwyn, an errand quickly told. "Prince Rupert and 200 horse, with prisoners, have passed through Micheldene." Half a dozen questions, rapidly put and promptly answered, elicited all the circumstances, the time, the direction taken, everything the patriotic Boniface could tell. They had come down the Plump Hill and gone off by Abenhall, for Newham or Westbury, or they might be making for Lydney. Down the Plump Hill, that accounted for their not being met. And the time, so near meeting, yet missing them, all the way to Hollymead and back for nothing. But lamenting the lost hours would not recover them. They must be made good by greater speed, and without wasting another word, the spur was buried deeper, and faster rode the foresters. Rode with a will, few of them whose heart was not in the pursuit. They were on the slot of a hated foe, against whom many had private cause of quarrel and vengeance. Prince Rupert, for the past 12 months, had been harrying the forest district, making their homes desolate, his licentious soldiers abusing their wives, sisters, and daughters. No wonder they wanted to come up with him. At mad speed they went dashing around Rardine Hill, down into the vale of Drybrook, then up by the wilderness, and down again to Micheldene, once more startling the townspeople from their slumbers, and filling them with fresh alarm. Soon over, on seeing it was the greencoats. Only a glimpse of them was got as they galloped on through, staying not a moment, never drawing bridle till they came to the forking of the roads by Abenhall, the right for Littledean, Newham, and Lydney, the left to Westbury. Then only for an instant, while Rob Wild swung his stalwart form out of the saddle and made inspection of the tracks, for the moon was once more clouded, and he could not make them out without dismounting. As before, brief time it took him, but a few seconds till he was back on his horse, saying, as he slung himself up, "They're gone Westbury ways, Colonel." And Westbury ways went the pursuers, reins loose and spurs plied afresh, with no thought of halting again, but a hope there would be no need for it, till at arm's length with the detested enemy. Even when the turn in Flaxley Valley brought the Severn in sight, with its wide sheet of floodwater, they stayed not to talk of it. To them it was no surprise, but a few hours before they had waited it farther up. No more was it matter of apprehension, as it had been to the party pursued. Instead, something to gratify and cheer them on, for, extending right and left far as the eye could reach, it seemed a very net, set by God's own hand, to catch the criminals they were in chase of. End of chapter 66. Recording by Matthew Reece, Cordova, Illinois. Chapter 67 of No Quarter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matthew Reece, Cordova, Illinois. No Quarter by Thomas Mayne REID. Chapter 67. A Guard Carelessly Kept. Notwithstanding Lunsford assurances, at best rather dubious, the river could not be crossed at Westbury without much difficulty and delay. The large horse-boat had received some damage, and it would take time to repair it. So Rupert and his following were constrained to keep on to Framelode Passage, 3 miles farther upstream. It would bring them into dangerous proximity with Gloucester, and should any of Massey's men be raiding down the river, they might find an enemy in front, even when over it. Still this was little likely, as Massey was believed to be himself out of Gloucester, operating on the northern side in the direction of Ledbury. Besides, Walwyn must have had information of their being at Hollymead to have drawn him into the forest at that time of night. Still from behind was the prince most apprehensive of danger, now greater by the traverse of flooded tracks that must needs be made before they could reach the passage. His failure to get across at Westbury seemed ominous of evil, and he had grown more nervous than ever. What if he should fail also at Framelode? Then, indeed, would he have to risk encounter with the redoubtable foresters, outnumbering his escort, as he knew. Already had they passed across several stretches of inundated ground, at each the rearguard being left on the dry land till the main body was well nigh through, and then following on to the next. But now one of longer extent lay before them, more than a mile of road leading on to the ferry being under water. Still the causeway, or rather where it ran, could be told by certain landmarks, and these Lunsford, as others of the escort, was acquainted with. But the flood was high over it, and the fording must be done cautiously, entailing loss of time. Moreover, if caught on the narrow way with no chance of maneuvering, scarce width enough for an about-face, any party pursuing would have them at a disadvantage, almost at mercy. Greater vigilance would be called for on the part of the rearguard, its strength needing to be doubled, and this was done, the prince, before taking to the water, himself inspecting it, and giving minute instructions to the officer in command. It was to be kept in ambush behind some trees that grew conveniently by, and, should pursuers appear, they were to be fired at soon as within range, the firing continued and the point held at all hazards till the last moment of retreat practicable. If no pursuit, then the guard to follow as before, at signal of bugle sent back. Reginald Trevor it was to whom the dangerous duty was assigned, and, as regarded courage and acquaintance with the ground, no officer of the escort was better fitted for it than he. None half so well, had his heart been in the work, which it was not, but all the other way. For every movement he was making, every act he had been called upon to accomplish since leaving Bristol, was not only involuntary on his part, but sorely against his will. Forced upon him had been the ceremony of introducing Prince Rupert to the woman he himself loved, and now was he further compelled to be one of those conducting her to a prison, as it were to her grave. for well knew he it would be the grave of her purity, the altar on which her young life's innocence was sure of being sacrificed. In the past, sinful himself, profligate as most of the Cavalier school, he had of late become a much altered man. That one honest love of his life had purified him, as such often does with natures like his. And now a great sorrow was to seal his purification, the object of his love about to suffer defilement, as it were before his face, and, as it were, with himself aiding and abetting it. His thoughts were black and bitter, his constrained duties repulsive, and as he stood by the flood's edge, looking after the escort that had commenced making way through it, he felt faint and sick at heart. Nor took he any steps to carry out the commands of the prince, either by placing the guard in ambush or making other disposition of it. So the men remained in their saddles, exposed on the high ridge of the road, just as they had come up, receiving but one order from him, that, should pursuers appear, they were not to fire till he gave the word. After which he separated from them and walked his horse back along the Westbury road, stopping at some 50 paces distance, and there staying alone. The soldiers thought it strange, for they had overheard the instructions given him. But as they were acquainted with his courage, and could not doubt his fidelity to the king's cause, they made no remark about his apparent remissness, supposing it some strategic design. Yet never was officer entrusted with guard less careful of his charge than he at that moment, caring, but not for its safety, instead wishing it attacked, defeated, destroyed, though he himself might be the first to fall. For still another change had of late come over his sentiments, a political one, brought about by the behavior of Prince Rupert and his associate crew, which for some time past had been a very career of criminal proceeding. It had inspired Reginald Trevor with a disgust for Cavalierism, as his cousin Eustace 2 years before. Growing stronger day by day, the last days and this night's work had decided him. He was royalist no more, though wearing the king's uniform. But he meant casting it off at the first opportunity, was even now blaming himself for not having sought an opportunity since they passed through Micheldean, reflecting whether, and in what way, such might yet be found. As he sate in his saddle listening, glad would he have been to hear hoof-strokes in the direction of Westbury, to see horsemen approaching, with the hostile war-cry for the Parliament. That might still save Vaga Powell, and nothing else could. In another hour she would be across the Severn, and on for Berkeley Castle, whither he must follow. But with no hope of being able to do anything for the doomed girl. On the one side as the other, all powerless to protect her, even with the sacrifice of his own life. And at that moment he would have laid it down for her, so much had generosity, love's offspring, mastered the selfishness of his nature. An interval of profound silence followed, the only sounds heard being the screams of wild fowl flying low over the flooded meadows, the occasional stamp of a restive steed among those of the guard, and the plunging of nigh 200 others far off in the water, gradually becoming less distinct as they waded farther. But, ere long, something else broke upon the night's stillness, as it reached the ear of Reginald Trevor, causing him to start in his saddle. There sate he, listening and vigilant, the sparkle of his eyes proclaiming it no sound that alarmed him, but one welcome and joy-giving. A dull pattering as of horses' hoofs, hundreds, making way over soft ground or along a muddy road. And so it was, the road from Westbury, the horses ridden by men in military formation, as the practised ear of the young soldier told him. But no other noise save the trample, no voice of man nor note of bugle. Soldiers were they, notwithstanding, and pursuing soldiers, led by one who knew how to carry pursuit to a successful issue, for it was Walwyn's horse. Still at a gallop their hoof-strokes were quickly nearer, sounding clearer, for there was no taking up of trail to delay them now. Away over the white water they saw a long dark line, serried by a turn in the route which had brought Rupert's following quarter-flank towards them. Saw, and knew it to be that they were after. At the same time seen themselves by Reginald Trevor, who rode back upon his guard, but not to inspire it to resistance nor place it in a position of defense. Instead, he seemed irresolute, uncertain whether to make stand or retreat. His men, heavy dragoons, had unslung their dragon-muzzled muskets and awaited the word fire, but no such word was spoken, no order given. Even when the approaching horsemen were charging up to them, shouting, "For God and Parliament!" even then no command from their officer to meet or withstand the charge. Nor did they then wish it. They saw the assailants were 10 to their 1. It was too late even for retreat. Should he call quarter, they were ready to chorus it. And just that called he, the instant after, to a man among the foremost of the charging party, his cousin. Their swords came together with a clash, Eustace the first to speak. "At last," he exclaimed, "at last we've met to keep our promise made. No quarter, I cry it." "And I cry quarter. Beg it." Never dropped blade quicker down from threatening thrust than that of Eustace Trevor. Never was combatant more surprised by the behavior of an adversary. "What do you mean?" he asked, in utter astonishment. "That I fight no more for prince or king. Henceforth, if they'll have it, my sword's at the service of the Parliament." "God bless me, Reg, how glad I am to hear you say that, and so near making mincemeat of one another." "Not of one another, Eust. You might have done that with me, may still, if you feel spiteful." "Good heavens, cousin, what has come over you? But I won't question now, there's no time." "There isn't. See yonder, Rupert and Lunsford with the Powells as their prisoners." "We know all that, but where are the ruffians taking them?" "Berkeley first, then Bristol. They're making to cross at Framelode Passage. It's but a short way beyond." "They shall never cross it. Can't before we come up with them. You'll be with us now, Reg?" "I will." The strange episode and dialogue took up but a few seconds' time, during which Rob Wilde, with a half-score files of foresters, had disarmed the unresisting rearguard. It was now under guard itself, and all ready for continuing the pursuit. And continued it was instantaneously, Sir Richard at the head of his greencoats, spurring straight into the flood, and on after the red ones, without further precaution either of silence or concealment. For he knew they would be seen now. End of chapter 67. Recording by Matthew Reece, Cordova, Illinois.
Chapter 68 of No Quarter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. No Quarter by Thomas Mayne REID. Chapter 68. A Fight in a Flood. Still but halfway across the inundated tract, and up to their saddle-girths in water, Rupert and his escort were floundering on. As already said, they marched by twos, this necessitated by the narrowness of the causeway, and so were lengthened in line. 200 horses in file formation take up a long stretch of road, however close the order. They had not yet sighted the enemy behind, nor had any intimation that one was there. For the snapping up of the guard had been done with little noise, the few shouts uttered being inaudible to them amid the continuous splashing and plunging of their own horses. It was only after the pursuing party was well out into the flood, clear of the tree-shadowed shore, that some of the hindmost, chancing to look back, saw what they took to be their rear guard in the water and riding after them. Saw it with surprise, as the signal for its advance had not been given, no note of bugle sounded. Neither could it be in retreat driven in. There had been no firing, not a shot, and by the prince's orders there should have been a prolonged fusillade guard of his, rear or van, retiring from its post without execution of his commands, had better have stayed and delivered itself up to the enemy. Well knowing this, they who first sighted the pursuers, thinking them of their own, were enough astonished to give way to ejaculations, which ran along the line quickly as lightning. "What is it?" demanded he at the head, on hearing them. "The rear guard, your Highness," answered one away at the back. "They're coming on after us." "Halt!" shouted the prince in a voice of thunder, half wheeling his horse, spurring out to the utmost edge of firm footing, and with craned neck looking back landward, for a time to see nothing much beyond the tail end of his escort, only the grey glimmer of water, with here and there the top of a pollard willow, for the capricious clouds had once more muffled the moon. But he heard something, the sound of the waiting horses, that made by his own now ceased from their being at a stand. And soon he saw the moving ones, the clouds, by like caprice, having drawn off their screen, letting full moonlight down upon the water. Soon saw them with alarm, for a dark mass was that in motion, too dark and too large for the score or so of files that had been detached as a guard. "Got, Colonel!" he exclaimed. "There are more men there than we left with Trevor. And why should he be coming on contrary to orders? It cannot be he." "Very strange if it be, Prince," rejoined Lunsford, the colonel spoken to, "and stranger still if not. Could a party have slipped past without the guard seeing them?" "Hardly possible, your Highness, unless by some swimming and a long roundabout way. These seem to come direct from it." The two talked hurriedly and with dismay upon their faces, for the dark mysterious thing, still drawing nigher and nearer, seemed some unearthly monster, a hydra approaching to destroy them. There was no time for further conjecturing. Friend or enemy, it must be met face to face, and Rupert, commanding the about, put spur to his horse and started toward the rear of the line. Time elapsed ere he could reach it. The deep water, with the men wheeling in file, impeded him, and before he was halfway rearward, there were shots, shouts, and the clashing of steel, all the sounds of a conflict. The monster had closed up and declared its character, as could be told by the hostile war words, "King" and "Parliament," fiercely commingling. Never shone moon on a stranger affair in the way of fight, two long strings of horsemen confronting one another on a narrow causeway where less than half a score of each could come to blows, no engaging in line, no turning or flank attack possible, and all up to the saddle flaps and water, up to the horses' hips where the fighting was hand to hand. Nor for long did it last. Little more than a minute after coming to close quarters, the Royalists found themselves overmatched, began to give way. File after file went down before their impetuous assailants, sabred or shot out of their saddles, till at length they doubled back on their line in retreat towards its former front. Some, in panic, forsook the causeway altogether, plunging into the flood on either side, in the hope to escape by swimming afar off. Sword in hand, with curses on his lips, Rupert met the rout, bursting his way through the broken ranks, slashing right and left in an endeavour to stem their retreat. More than one of his own men fell before his desperate fury, but on reaching the rear he had to cross blades with a man who was his master at sword play, and all the skill appertaining, which he knew soon as coming to the engage, and in his antagonist recognizing Sir Richard Walwyn. It was quick work between them. At the very first lunge from guard, the prince's sword getting whipped out of his hand and sent whirling off into the water, the old trick by which Sir Richard had disarmed the ex-gentleman usher. With a fierce oath, Rupert drew a pistol from his holster and was about to fire at his adroit adversary when another face presented itself before him, that of a man he had better reason to shoot down. "Dog! Traitor! Turncoat!" he shouted, in tone of vengeful anger. "'Tis to you we owe this. I give you death in payment." And the shot sped, tumbling Reginald Trevor out of the saddle. But there was still a Trevor on horseback to confront the prince, with sword already fleshed and blade dripping blood. The touch of his spur brought him face to face with Rupert, and alone, for just as the latter, Sir Richard had caught sight of another man he more wished to have dealings with, Lunsford, and dashed straight towards him, but not to attain close quarters. And the cowardly ex-lieutenant of the Tower there was neither fight nor stand. The sight of Colonel Walwyn was of itself enough to palsy his hands, alone the bridle one obeying him, and with it, wrenching his horse round, he made ignominious retreat. No more did the other pair get engaged. Rupert had but his second pistol, which, being discharged at Eustace Trevor, fortunately without effect, left him weaponless, and seeing all his escort in retreat, he turned tail too, soon disappearing amid the ruck. The rout now complete, with the scarlet coats it was sauve qui peuit, with the green ones only a question of cutting down the panic-stricken fugitives, or making prisoner those who cried quarter, and most cried that, shouted it to the utmost strength of their lungs. On went the victorious foresters along the flooded way, alternately sabering and capturing, the big sergeant and Hubert doing their full share of both, on till they came to a party of captives they had not taken, nor guarded these, their late guards having been too glad to get away, leaving them to themselves. Sabrina! Richard! Vaga! Eustace! 4 names, pronounced in joyous exclamation amid the din, and by 4 distinct voices, all with the epithet dear conjoined. Not another word then, not another moment there, for the pursuit must be continued. The capture of Prince Rupert would be a thing of consequence, independent of all private feelings, and Sir Richard longed to settle scores with Lunsford. So on went he and his in chase of the now scattered escort. But not again to come up with a pair of profligates. The stoppage, short as it was, had given them time to make Framelode Ferry, where, leaping from the horses and into a light boat, they were out of sword's reach and range of bullet before the pursuers could close upon them. Still within earshot of angry speech, however, hurled after them by the triumphant foresters, with many a taunt, many the vile epithet bestowed. A degradation deserved, and other men than they would have felt its sting and shame, but not this scion of royalty, toast type and model of cavalierism. Happy at having escaped with a whole skin, he but laughed back, rejoicing in the life still left him for future crimes to be committed. And many the one was he afterwards guilty of, though short from that time was his rule in the city of Bristol. Once again and soon was it enfiladed by an armed force, not for siege or leaguer, but instant assault, for the man who commanded was he who later on gave laws to all England, gave her the only glimpse of real liberty she has ever enjoyed, the only gleam of true glory. When Cromwell stood before Bristol's gates and said surrender, it was in no tone of doubting requisition, but stern demand. The son of Elector Palatinate, hearing it, hastened to comply, but too glad to get terms for his life. Which he got, with his liberty, and more, far too much being conceded by his generous conqueror, permitted to march out, bag and baggage, with a long retinue of bullies, sycophants, and strumpets, leaving behind a longer list of victims, among them the ill-starred Clarice Lalande. As he passed away from the place he made a place of bawdry. It was amid jeers and bitter curses. A scene pleasanter to describe, one more congenial to honest pen, occurred shortly after in the sister city of Gloucester, within its ancient cathedral, at whose altar simultaneously stood 4 couples in the act of being made man and wife. Wedded they were, and their names entered into the big book of marriage registry, from which the writer does not deem it necessary to copy them verbatim, enough to give them as already known to the reader, the brides being Sabrina and Vaga Powell, Winifred and Gwynthien, their respective bridegrooms Colonel Sir Richard Walwyn, Captain Eustace Trevor, Sergeant Wilde, and Trumpeter Hubert. While being made happy amid the many joyous faces around, one alone wore a cast of sadness, yet with resignation, that of Reginald Trevor, still living, for the shot which struck him out of his saddle on the flooded causeway of Framelode had but wounded him, and he was well again, in body, not spirit, for within his heart was a wound that might never be well. He had suffered bitterly, was still suffering, but with soul now purified and subdued was better able to bear it, and bore it manfully. Generously, too, for just as, when meeting his cousin outside Hollymead Gate, he had offered him his sword to avenge defeat, now honoured he him by his presence at a ceremony which was as the sacrifice of himself. Still another incident calls for record, of date some 6 years later, and some months preceding that event, which again brought England's liberty to its lowest ebb, her glory to greatest shame, the so-called Restoration. Before this curse of curses came, Ambrose Powell, predicting it, foreseeing evil to him and his, gathered up his household gods and took ship with him to the colonies across the Atlantic, accompanied by all the personages who had appeared at that marriage ceremony in the Cathedral of Gloucester, and by many more, Cadger Jack among them. Reginald Trevor, too, was of the colonizing band, long becoming accustomed to bearing the broken heart, which brokenly lives on, with but little pain, growing ever less, for he could now look upon Vaga Powell as his cousin's wife, to himself as a kind of sister, almost without thought of the unhappy past. Well it was for all of them they went away to become part of that people, the freest, most powerful, and most prosperous on earth. Had they stayed, it would have been to suffer persecution, the fate of all when they fought for England's freedom, save the false ones and cravens who cried quarter on their knees, basely begged it from that loathsome monster of iniquity, the merry monarch. And Rupert, Prince of Cavaliers, what became of him? He too returned with the Restoration, another of its curses, fresh from a long career of piracy in the West Indian seas, to be made Lord High Admiral of England, with no end of other honours and emoluments heaped upon him, to live for years after a life of luxurious ease, die in the purple, and be buried with all pomp and ceremony. For though a pirate, he was still a prince of the blood royal. The end. End of chapter 68. End of No Quarter by Thomas Mayne REID.